Thank you. This is a very low lectern for me. I seem to be too tall. But I had originally planned to do my lecture in German, as you can see with the title, but I've lived in England for so long, and those among us who share a similar experience know that you sort of kind of lose a proverb a week on average. And I just feel like I'm on safer terrain doing this in English, so here we go. Well, how many of you are familiar with the biography of Istva and Anhalt? We are not in a class or anything, but hands up. Let me introduce him to you. I'm glad few people are, otherwise I wouldn't have a paper. Istva Anhalt was born on 12 April 1919 in Budapest. While his family background was not overly musical, Anhalt learned to play the piano, and in 1936, the 17-year-old started composition lessons with Gesa Falk. A year later, he was admitted to the Ferenc Liszt Conservatory, where he became a composition pupil of Sultan Kodály. In 1941, he finished his studies there, enrolled in Turkish linguistics at the Pazmani University, and took up a conducting course with János Ferencig. From his school days onwards, the assimilated Jew Anhalt had been confronted with the increase of anti-Semitism in Admiral Miklos Horthy's proto-fascist Hungary. I always find it absolutely wonderful that he was an admiral when Hungary clearly has no sea. They were perhaps on Lake Balaton, I'm not sure. While the first openly anti-Semitic legislation dates to 1920, the year after Anhalt's birth, the situation for Hungary's Jews worsened drastically in 1940. In the hope of regaining the territories lost after World War I, and in a blatant attempt at establishing itself as a third superpower, Hungary joined the German-Italian Axis in 1940. In 1941, the Hungarian army joined Operation Barbarossa at the Eastern Front line. On December 1st, 1942, Anhalt was thrown out of university and interned in a forced labor camp for Jewish youths. And a composer who, of course, shares the same fate is Serge Ligeti. The role of Anhalt's unit was to support the Hungarian army. Stationed in the Carpathian Mountains near the Hungarian-Romanian border, Anhalt and his fellow inmates were variously deployed in modern-day Romania and Ukraine, though at the time many of these places would not have been in what was then Romania and the Ukraine. In May 1944, the systematic deportation of all Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz began. Anhalt attempted to escape the labor camp in the summer of 1944, but his escape failed and he was quickly re-interned. A second attempt, however, was successful, and Anhalt escaped the camp in November 1944. The priest János Antal helped Anhalt disguise as a Silesian priest, and friends from better days, the De Kerpeli family in Budapest, offered him a hiding place where he endured the remainder of the war. Teresa de Kerpeli's novel, A Crown for Ashes, and her autobiography, Of Love and Wars, give testimony of Anhalt's hiding. A brief and unsalaried stint as repetiteur at the Budapest Opera in early 1945 came to an end in the summer of that year, and Anhalt, now stateless, left Hungary in January 1946 for Paris. Funded by a stipend of the Union des étudiants juifs de France, he took private lessons in composition with Nadia Boulanger and in piano with Sulima Stravinsky. A further grant by the Conservatoire enabled him to study conducting there with Louis Forestier. Seemingly well-trained in obtaining funding by now, 1949 saw Anhalt obtain a Lady Davis Fellowship that enabled him to move to Canada. Established in 1948, these fellowships were designed to facilitate the migration of stateless European intellectuals to Canada. As a Lady Davis Fellow, Anhalt was appointed assistant professor at the music department at McGill University in Montreal. 6 years later, in 1955, he became a naturalized Canadian citizen. In the late 50s, his growing interest with electronic music, which he had first experienced in Cologne, resulted in work at the Electronic Music Laboratory of the National Research Council in Ottawa, at the Columbia Princeton Center in New York, and at the Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey. Based on these research activities, 1964 saw Anhalt found the first Canadian studio for electronic music at McGill, over which he presided until 1971. In '69, Anhalt was Slee Visiting Professor for Composition at the State University of New York, and from '71 to '81, Director of the Music Department of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, where he retired in '84. In '82 and '91, respectively, Anhalt was awarded honorary doctorates from McGill and Queen's. If there's ever been a success story, I think this is one of them. Tikkun, score of commemoration. At first glance, it seems like Anhalt's compositions from the mid-1980s onwards reveal a rather sudden engagement with the composer's autobiography, and specifically with his Jewishness. Thisness of '86 recapitulates Anhalt's own wartime experiences, and a trilogy of compositions for orchestra, Simulacrum and Spark Scraps, both '87, and Sonance Resonance Welche Töne of '89. This trilogy is likewise permeated by autobiographical aspects. Perhaps the most interesting composition, for the purpose of this conference anyway, is Tracy's Tikkun. Composed in 1994, it is a piece of musical theater for one singer only. Monologues, as well as internal dialogues of remembrance and memory, are portrayed as traces of the past in the psyche of the protagonist. Anhalt dedicated the work to those of his classmates from the Kodaly composition course who perished as Jewish slave laborers in camps similar to the one where Anhalt had been interned. And you can see the dedication there in Anhalt's own hand on the left-hand side of the slide. I'll just play the beginning.
Is someone here speaking? I'm listening. Don't you see your share of hope time is nearly spent, next to nothing remains. Are you prepared, ready to fall into the void, the bottomless shaft, devoid of light, with no shapes left, no shapes left to be seen. That's what's ahead.
This all sounds pretty neat, doesn't it? A Holocaust survivor addresses his traumatic experience in a creative way. A true score of commemoration, it would seem. So far so obvious. Or is it? But is it really that straightforward? Perhaps I have too suspicious a mind, but in my experience, apparent explanations that seem neat, tidy, simple, and obvious all too often turn out to be one-sided, inaccurate, cliched, and overtly simplistic. Perhaps the most obvious point to make about obvious points is that they are not usually obvious. What's obvious in reality Is my reading that straitjackets biographies such as Anhalt's and works such as Tikkun into my preconceived notions of what I would like to find and what I then conveniently end up finding? And that makes me suspicious, and so I look for cracks. In fact, in my view at least, cracks soon appear in the tidy description of Tikkun as a stereotypical case of a composer dealing with his past. One of these cracks is the following question. Why did it take so long, over 4 decades, for Anhalt to address his experience with the Holocaust? The short answer to this question is, I don't know. And experience tells me that when the short answer to a question is, I don't know, one shouldn't attempt a long one. But you know, of course, what's coming. I've got a few minutes left, so I will indeed attempt a long answer. In fact, I will make matters worse and attempt 2 long answers. Attempt of a possible long answer number 1. Hypothesis. It did not take Anhalt so long to address his experience of the Holocaust at all. Instead, Anhalt's entire work post-1945 deals with his displacement more widely, albeit not always in obvious ways. You've just heard the beginning of the Fantasia for piano, composed in 1954 in Canada by Anhalt. The beginning leaves little doubt about Anhalt's compositional technical preference. This is textbook dodecaphony. The 12-note series on which the work is based is presented right away, boldly, without any preparation in the opening bar. The predominant idiom is that of an almost completely orthodox Schoenbergian technician, while the mathematical symmetry of the row parallels the architectural characteristics of several of Webern's rows in the symphony, Opus 21. Beyond these very technical compositional similarities, Anhalt's composition, to my ears, combines a Weberian architecture with Alban Berg's tendency towards lyricism and total definition, as well as a subtlety and romanticist warmth. Tonality is never completely abandoned. A major third outlines the pitch structure and contributes to the establishment of an implied tonal center, C, as I think you can all see quite clearly, which is emphasized not only in the row, but throughout the work. Well, now, such technical analyses in a paper are usually boring. So, to what extent could it be possible to consider this piece as a score of commemoration? It is at this point where the plentiful biographical baggage I have laid onto you becomes important. On a biographical level, Anhalt's education with Kodály and later with Boulanger are not exactly the most obvious pretexts for a turn towards the language of the Schoenberg school. Boulanger discouraged Anhalt from engaging with dodecaphony, and the Kodály pupils who remained in Hungary certainly eschewed it. Second, the move towards dodecaphony seems astonishing considering the conservative musical contexts of Anhalt's adopted home, Canada, considering that he had to be interested in acculturating himself and integrating into the musical establishments. The introduction of a musical idiom and texture closely linked to a tiny circle of Central European interwar expressionists can hardly have been conducive to any aim of integrating into the musical circles. Many expressions of open hostility to interwar expressionism, and the Schoenberg school in particular, by Canadian critics and writers could be quoted here, but even a statement by Canadian composer and Anhalt friend John Beckwith should suffice to bring my point across. In 1956, Beckwith associated not only Anhalt's music, but also that of immigrants Otto Joachim and Udo Kassemetz as effectively foreign, as he wrote, and I quote, Acquaintance with the music of Joachim and Kachemetz suggests that perhaps the newcomers are the only composers in Canada applying 12-note procedures in anything like the strict fashion of Krennek, Verban, and middle period Schönberg. This impression is strengthened when one comes to consider the music of Istva and Anhalt, Hungarian-born, Paris-trained composer now teaching at McGill. End quote. Paradoxically, the move towards dodecaphony seems unexpected also in the context of post-war Western Europe. In the exclusive circles of the progressivist avant-garde on the European continent, a piece like Anhalt's Fantasia was too old to be taken seriously, but too young to have already become canonical. While daring in the Canadian context, in the historical context of 1950s Darmstadt and Donaueschingen, Boulez and Stockhausen, Anhalt's Fantasia could acquire, at best, nostalgic value. Adorno's description of Bartók's post-migration works, peppered with his typical value judgments, refers to this point and may well be adopted here. And I quote, "Bartók's later works, such as his violin concerto, are indeed traditionalist music. Not forcefully broken reprises of something long gone, but almost naive continuations. Late masterworks, to be sure, but domesticated ones, no longer manifestations of a threatening and eruptive quality of something unheard of, etwas Unerhörtem. His development is marked by a peculiar retrospective force." End quote. And as far as Anhalt is concerned, I think this is precisely the point. This venturing towards an aesthetic very much associated with the Central European interwar avant-garde, an aesthetic of a particular music, in a particular place that had, by 1945, all but disappeared from the map, and for which there are no obvious biographical reasons on Anhalt's part, this has to be interpreted as a very deliberate compositional choice, a choice as unexpected as it was risky in the context of the comparatively conservative cultural environments in Canada and the radically progressive musical circles on the European continent. Paraphrasing Edward Said, one could then argue that this turn to dodecaphony indicates a displaced nostalgia, an expression of a memory of profound loss. Attempt of a possible long answer number 2, hypothesis. Tikkun does not represent an attempt by Anhalt to deal with his own experience of the Holocaust at all, and even if it did, it should not be historicized in such a way. First, an obvious point. Tikkun never mentions the words Jew, Holocaust, or anti-Semitism. The libretto does not openly reference the Holocaust. Indeed, considering that Tikkun is the last in a triad of operas in each of which a religion takes center stage, Catholicism in the preceding La Tourangelle and Protestantism in Winthrop, it is tempting to argue that one of the main topics of Tikkun is Judaism more generally. The meaning of the word Tikkun plays into this, of course. It is a concept from Kabbalistic thought, which Gershom Scholem has described as, quote, the restoration of the universe to its original design, end quote. Second, discovering traces of the Holocaust in the work merely because its author personally experienced persecution, and consequently coming full circle by suggesting that the work confirms the author's status as a survivor or exile, for example, is problematic because it takes the outcome of analysis for the process of analysis. The presupposition that biographical experience are the sole determinant of creative output is as absurd as suggesting that every minute experience faced by a creative artist is likely to shape her art. This is not to say that the Holocaust is a minute experience. Still, at every stage of her life, a composer can keep composing the same way, or change her approach or style, or stop composing, or return to composing for any number of circumstantial reasons, financial, aesthetic, or whatever, or without any evidently traceable reason. As Karl Dahlhaus has it, quote, the attempt to associate specific works with specific biographically tangible elements of the life shows time and again that a connection that looks plausible as long as it is left to vague suggestion proves to be dubious and fraught with more guesswork than is desirable as soon as any attempt is made to be precise about it, end quote. And indeed, Istvan Anhalt suggested in 1977, quote, There is no formula for predictably defining how a man writes by using his geographical and family origins as firm and sole indicators. His birthplace and ancestry may be of great or little consequence, or they may appear to have no direct influence. End quote. And even if it were a composer's intention to commemorate her own experience with the Holocaust, this intended meaning of the composer can never be the principal factor in the analysis and understanding of art. Jacques Derrida reminds us that an artist can always say more, less, or something else than she would mean, or even though we know about the intended meaning through sketches, letters, publications, personal notes, etc., convey it unsuccessfully, or change her mind, or mean more or less than analysis can reveal or one can detect, or mean something that words cannot express, or mean something else at different times and in different places, or mean something and not be aware of it, or mean things that are at the same time, many things at the same time, or not mean anything at all. The author's intentions, be they conscious, subconscious, or unconscious, are one aspect of the material that nurtures the artwork's ontological genesis, but need not necessarily affect its phenomenological existence. In a nutshell, while it is clear that Anhalt was affected by displacement and by the Holocaust, his biography is not the starting point or basis from which to approach his works. What I am saying here in my second long answer is not that Tikkun has nothing to do with the Holocaust. What I am suggesting, however, is that Anhalt's personal experience with the Holocaust is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for the composition of any piece addressing the Holocaust. I am not only referring to the challenge, now half a century old, to the simplistic linkage between author and work. I am also referring to the perhaps more radical notion that the only music that could truly be Holocaust music must be silent, mirroring the silence of the silenced. Phenomenologically, no singing can sound out of a gas chamber. And yet ontologically, there is music. The music we know the murdered would have sounded had they lived. But let me leave the otherworldly behind and turn to another point, one concerning respect for the living. Anhalt has repeatedly refused to be called a victim, let alone a survivor. For example, referring not only to his escape from the labor camp, but to his displacements and movements and migrations generally, Anhalt wrote in 2008, quote, "The multiple escapes were stations in my self-liberation. The final station in this has proved to be Kingston." End quote. And elsewhere he writes, quote, "I can say without any hesitation that I have never regarded my move from my native Hungary as moving into exile. I moved away from there of my own free volition, behind which there was a clear view that by this I am liberating myself." End quote. On the occasion of the premiere of Tikkun, Anhalt mentioned in a radio interview that the work was about the memory of every man. Asked whether this every man could include Anhalt himself, he replied, quote, "If you insist, count me in. I might belong to a group of people who recognize what the piece is singing about. I don't know. It would be coy of me to say that there's nothing of me in this opera. I did acquit every darn note to paper." End quote. Are these the words of a traumatized composer? I think not. Anhalt's reluctance to be victimized must urge me as a musicologist to take him seriously, though. That means that reducing any of his works to any one singular event or phenomenon would be patronizing and ethically inappropriate, even if that event is the Holocaust. It is important for us to remember and document the Holocaust. Finding its traces in a piece of music against the composer's wishes, however, is not only tantamount to lugubrious voyeurism, it also poses an ethical dilemma. I wonder, could there be a conclusion to my paper? Let's see what we have. Two contradictory suggestions then, one suggesting traces of commemoration well-nigh everywhere in Anhalt's scores, the second calling into question the validity of such an approach and aiming towards the other extreme. Can the two talk to each other? I have portrayed both compositions as framed by tense political contexts, the experience of the Holocaust and the displacement resulting from it. But in so doing, I have also referenced Hannah Arendt's phrase, refugees are the vanguard of their people. And what this of course means is that they take an active aesthetic political stance within the context of their time. It is then possible to see Anhalt not as a victim of an experience of the past with which he deals in his compositions. Perhaps we should not read either composition, the Fantasia or Tikkun, as a dealing with the past, and maybe we should see neither as a score of commemoration. But this does not exclude the possibility of traces of the past in them. What I would argue is that both pieces engender spaces of mobility and creative opportunities. In that sense, maybe they refer at least as much to their present and their future as they do to their past. Perhaps the two compositions I have introduced you to today invite us to call into question the bigger narrative of Vergangenheitsbewältigung. To paraphrase Jim Sampson, quote, "Little stories have a way of constantly taking detours from the simple characterizations offered by grand narratives. They allow us to see around the edges of the grand narratives, lighting them up in various ways. They can instantiate them, critique them, revise them," end quote. Moreover, in sitting on the fence, so to speak, between different cultural spheres and not fully integrated into either, as the proverbial other, Anhalt's works do not describe displacement or the displacement as a sudden move between two static places, home and exile, just as they do not suggest the Holocaust as a scenic event in isolation. Sitting on the fence, apart from being a painful experience, is marked by the dialectics of being on the boundary of various places and in the center between them at the same time. The other is at once periphery and center. Viewed from this angle, Tikkun and the Fantasia speak of the connection to multiple worlds and to no one solitary world at once. They challenge the notion of a piece that is exclusively or even primarily one of commemoration, rather than a hybrid multitude of experiences that is outside the reach of analysis. Tikkun and the Fantasia also challenge notions of physical and virtual stasis, thus creating spaces of mobility and opportunity. The composer, Anhalt, is thus transformed from passive survivor victim into an empowered and mobile player. My point here is this. If there is mobility and multi-stranded hybridity intrinsic to Anhalt's works, and I believe there is, they then mirror the mobility of the displaced, therefore creating hybrid and non-static spaces of diversity. For the purpose of this conference, a reading that highlights mobility represents a challenge to narratives favoring trauma and the overcoming of it. Anhalt's Tikkun, as much as the Fantasia, fit into the space created by the mobility of displacement, space here understood as the other two place, a displacement. Considering the music of a composer like Anhalt in this light invites us to interrogate and perhaps ultimately question binaries such as the one of traumatized victim and score of commemoration. It can be extremely tempting for musicologists to analyze any given work by any given composer in such a way as to detect in it unequivocal evidence of that composer's own experience of the Holocaust, particularly so since the stories of the survivors are often colorful and tragic. In fact, I would suggest, maybe provocatively, that it is possible to read the Holocaust into every single work composed by every single survivor. And by exactly the same token and by exactly the same methodology, it is possible to deny a simplistic linkage between the composer's biography and their personal experience of the Holocaust at all. Perhaps we should refrain from participating in this fallacy. And in urging us to do so, I return to my first, short answer, which I suggested at the time was perhaps the best one, and to which I find myself returning time and again. I don't know. Thank you.